right? The fact that we have real disagreements, the fact that we have difficult conversations, the fact that we have painful conversations is not a bug of democracy. It's a feature of democracy. And yes, that is hard.
But no one is saying you shouldn't have hard conversations. Again, the straw man you guys brought into the studio with you here should really be given a mic. I want to hear from the straw man.
And difficult, but
it's just so big.
Again, how can we expect that the process of overcoming marginalization is going to be fair? And I think the discourse has taken this understandable critique of society and the way we operate and the burdens we place on marginalized people. And we've somehow said, well, the one place that we have control over whether we allow for that marginalization is in the strategies we use to overcome it. We're not going to engage in that because it's sort of self-oppression. And I think that is such a self-defeating and counter.
Who is doing that? You're talking about this being a pervasive political problem. Name some names. Who is doing that? Because I haven't seen that happen in politics with anything that is happening right now. This is, from my opinion, from my point of view, completely fabricated. It's disappointing to a degree I find difficult to articulate. Nobody. Exactly, Winnie Rose.
Counterproductive approach.
I've been thinking in the past couple of months, because we are in the most illiberal era of my lifetime in American politics. I don't mean liberalism in the sense of supporting or not supporting universal health care, but in terms of due process, in terms of tolerance, in terms of the basic practice of politics and living amidst each other.
I need to practice like a voice to do for Ezra Klein so I can properly make fun of him in other segments.
And it's also made me think about the need to clearly define what the practice of liberalism itself is.
Oh boy, let's redefine liberalism. And oddly enough, it's the exact same definition we have of neoliberalism, but he's calling it abundance liberalism.
What do you think it is?
I think it is the recognition that in a free society, we are going to live and think differently.
Yeah.
I think it is the allowance of that disagreement in the public square and the tussle of that disagreement in the public square.
Yep.
And that is uncomfortable.
The engagement in the marketplace of ideas. Okay. So liberalism is when you have conversations with people.
That is not easy. And yes, there are going to be people in that conversation for whom it's going to be more difficult.
I have to say, this is hurting me on a level that's difficult to articulate. Lib, laugh, leave. Liberalism is so much more than just having a conversation is not liberalism. Jesus. It's just not. How can you give such a politically incoherent answer as a member of Congress?
And more uncomfortable. But in the internet world, you can't suppress diversity of thought. It will always bubble up, but it will bubble up if suppressed with an extra.
What are you talking about? The suppression of free thought. What, in your world, what does that mean? Because in my world, it means, the president of the United States sending FBI agents to, knock on the doors of leftists, or, the state coming down hard on messaging it doesn't like from independent journalists or outlets. That, to me, would be a form of oppression. But in this particular podcast room, the oppression really seems to be people on Blue Sky are mean to us when we post, though. It really does come down to, but people don't like what we have to say. They're allowed to not like it. That's not oppression.
Extra bitterness and an extremism fostered in that echo chamber that it's been suppressed to, it'll inevitably bubble up like a volcano. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. I will say, I think, while the left made this mistake of fostering an illiberalism based on a sort of false sense of cultural victory. I think now the right is making the exact same mistake. I think they're overplaying their hand. I think they're interpreting the...
I love that her analysis is just that, the left, the LGBTQ transes of a decade ago overplayed their hand by wanting to be included in society. And then the conservative movement is doing the same thing by going to war with Iran. Potato, potato,
2024 election to be a cultural mandate that is much greater than what it actually is. And I think that if they continue to do that, there will be a backlash to the illiberalism, the cultural illiberalism, not just the legal illiberalism, the cultural liberalism of the right, in the same way that there's been a backlash to the cultural illiberalism of the left.
I couldn't, I think, agree with that more. We're going to get to that. I want to talk for a minute about the 2024 election and the aftermath. So there's been a lot of rethinking and self-recrimination among Democrats.
And Velvet, I totally hear you. The centrist brain rot is weirdly the most infuriating because we're far closer to it, It's closer to home. It's a more devastating shot across the bow because this is the current enemy within the Democratic Party, guys. When I've been talking about the inter-party conflict within the Democratic Party, it is it's right here. These are the people who are trying to define what the future of the Democratic Party is going to be. They are backed by an awful lot of money. They are backed by big crypto organizations. They're backed by a lot of money. And on the other hand, we have people who actually want to do something. You've got your Zoran Mamdanis and such. And it's just it's going to come down to a knockdown, drag out fight for the soul of the party, guys. She's so unbelievably frustrating, though. God, she could have been so much more than she is. She's just another self-blaming, internalized, phobia-riddled disappointment. I mean, barring the a lot of those adjectives that I'm not entirely sure about, I am disappointed. Yeah,
Democrats. One of the comments that got a lot of attention came right after the election when Seth Moulton, who's your colleague, a Democratic congressman from Massachusetts, said, quote, "Democrats spend way too much time trying not to offend anyone rather than being brutally honest about the challenges many Americans face. I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a male or formerly male athlete. But as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that."
Yeah. So now we get into an interesting part of the show. So yeah, they're about to start talking about trans sports and specifically, Seth Moulton and his comments about trans girls in sports. And this is when I knew that I had to talk about this on stream because this is just some shit.
What did you think when you heard that?
One, that it wasn't the language that I would use.
What language would you use instead of "I don't want my little girl to be run over by a male"? What language would you use instead? Again, this is why I just full-throatedly threw myself into researching trans people in sport and just the entire thing is horseshit. I don't understand why a single Dem cedes any ground to the conservative argument. The cowardice around this subject is frankly unbelievable when you look into the actual data. And really, again, I'm just going to remind you guys, I have videos on my channel going over the studies and stuff, but literally the only debate that I've been able to find in the medical literature is, does a trans girl have to be on HRT for 1 year or 2 years on HRT before they reach parity with cis women? That's it. And almost no Dems are willing to argue on it. It's crazy. But here we are. God, I wish there was anyone curious enough to actually look up that shit.
But I think it came from a larger belief that the Democratic Party needed to start to have an open conversation about our illiberalism, that we needed to recognize that we were talking to ourselves. We were fighting fights that felt viscerally comforting to our own base, or fighting fights in a way that felt viscerally comforting to our own base, rather than maintaining proximity to the public and being normal people. I think the sports conversation is
Can we just
than maintaining proximity to the public and being normal people.
That's, I think, where we get hung up, right? Being normal people. Because for those who are unsure what I mean by that, there is a line of thought in the trans community that the reason trans people have not gained as much mainstream acceptance as we should get is because we're simply not normal enough. You know, it's because of all of those weird trans cat ladies. It's because of all of those weird trans girls with their blue hair and their programming socks and their blahages. It's because of all of that. Why can't you just be normal about it? And to be normal is to fit into that heteronormative expectations. You know, that collection of expectations about how heteronormative people should act and behave and present themselves and talk. And that's not how this works, you know? Because it doesn't matter if trans people act normal or not. It doesn't matter. So being authentically ourselves is our best course of action. The idea that, oh, well, you know, you should be a trad wife. If you're a trans woman or like a non-binary femme, you should be a trad wife. And then everyone will be nice to you and they'll accept you. It just doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. Like, I'm sorry. This is brain rot. This is like saying, oh, well, look, you might be a lesbian, but why aren't you dressing like a femme lesbian? You know, like if you just dressed normal and wore like a dress and smiled more, grew your hair out a little bit, then you know, they wouldn't think those things about us. You're giving lesbians a bad name. Like it's just the same old tired rhetoric used for gay people being recycled to attack trans people. It's weird. And I'm not saying that that's what Sarah McBride is doing here, but the appeal to normalcy that is underlying what she's saying is rooted in that exact ideological framework.
I think the sports conversation is a good one, because I think, you know, there's a big difference between banning trans young people from extracurricular programs consistent with their gender identity and recognizing that there's room for nuance in this conversation.
What is the room for nuance? And again, what's really interesting is how completely absent from the conversation, completely absent, is the acknowledgement that, like, trans girls in sports became an issue because of, you know, right-wing agents like Christopher Rufo, you know, because the Republican Party paid folks to find and dig up wedge issues, and surprise, surprise, they found one, and then funneled a ton of money into blowing it up into becoming the news story. You know, it's not difficult to understand why this happened, but they don't talk about it. They talk about it like this is a natural outgrowth of like the population, that like people were just naturally talking all the time about trans high school athletics. Like, you can't even get the general population to talk about like cisgender high school athletics. Like, come on, what are we talking about here?
And I think the notion that we created this all on or all off mentality, that you had to be perfect on trans rights across the board, use exactly the right language, and unless you do that, you're a bigot, you're an enemy. And when you create a binary all on or all off option for people, you're going to have a lot of imperfect allies who are going to inevitably choose the all off option. And what ends up happening is the left will excommunicate someone who not only...
Again, just throwing this out there, when she says the left excommunicates someone, she's just saying people on Blue Sky are mean to them. Like, I'm sorry, if you actually have principles, they need to be like firmly rooted and not dependent on people liking you. Like, I'm sorry, I have my beliefs on my politics, and like that's independent of whether or not you guys are particularly fans of them. You know, like this is just imagined people in the audience would boo me. You know, the mentality is weak.
Seth voted against the ban on trans athletes, but we would excommunicate someone who uses imperfect language. Yes, look, again.
Oh, what happened to Seth Moulton again? What did he get fired? You know what? Let's take a look. Seth Moulton. What happened to Seth Moulton? Let's see. Oh, Yep, he's just still in office. So when you say he got excommunicated, what does that mean? Is it just people got mad at him online? Won't you think of Seth's feelings?
Not language I would use, but we would excommunicate someone who's saying that there's nuance.
Not language you would use, but would you say the same thing in different words?
This conversation and uses language that we don't approve of, yet still votes.
I'm sorry. Would you? It's not the language that we don't approve of. It's the position that like trans girls are men. That's the position. Like I'm sorry if you had a little trans girl in like going into high school sports, Sarah, and that colleague of yours is calling your daughter a man because she wants to play sports in high school. That colleague is painting out your daughter to be a threat to his daughter by her very existence. Like, I'm sorry, it's not the words he chose, it's the idea that he chose to propagate.
The quote, the right way is exactly what's wrong with our approach. And look, Seth's not going anywhere, but for a lot of everyday folks, if they think how Seth thinks, or if they think that there's room for nuance in this conversation and we tell them, you're a bigot, you're not welcomed here, you're not part of our coalition, we will not consider you an ally. The right's done a very good job of saying, listen, you have violated the illiberalism of the left, you have been cast aside for your common sense, welcome into our club. And then human nature starts...
I'm really sorry.
Nuance in this conversation and we tell them, you're a bigot, you're not welcomed here, you're not part of our coalition, we will not consider you an ally. The right's done a very good job of saying, listen, you have violated the illiberalism of the left, you have been cast aside for your common sense, welcome into our club.
And I'm sorry, but painting it this way is just not how the right works. Like the idea that people are just they're being yelled at on trans issues, so they're gonna change all of their politics and become conservative. That's not how it works.
And then human nature starts to be, once you then get welcomed into that club, human nature is, well, I was with the Democratic Party on 90% of things, maybe against them on 10% of things, or sort of in the middle on 10%. Once you get welcomed into that other club, human psychology is you start to adopt those positions. And instead of being with us on 90% of things and against us on 10% of things, that person now welcomed into the far right club starts to be against us on 90% of things and with us on only 10% of things. And I think that dynamic is part of the regression that we have seen. And not only the regression we've seen.
You know, there's a really great anecdote, story, whatever, fable about the Nazi bar. You know, you have a man who runs a bar. One night, a guy with Nazi tattoos comes in, sits down at the bar, but it's just one Nazi. So the man serves him a drink, and the next night he comes with a few more of his Nazi friends. Next day, a few more. Next day, a few more, and suddenly it's a Nazi bar. I just don't think that this is what's happening. Like, I just think that she's really full of shit, you know? There isn't an organic shift because people on Twitter are being mean. The shift is happening because of a coordinated propaganda campaign that is, being done with the support of the world's richest man on one of the world's most widely used social media platforms, also being pushed by literally the dominant political powers in this country, while also being
these abundant
pushed by
libs are
billionaires.
focusing on this stuff because as bought and paid for neolibs they can't focus on pushing back against the oligarchy.
I mean, yeah, But like, what's fascinating is they can't even focus on pushing back against Republicans. Also, Quasi-Spec, thank you for the 1,000 biddies over on Twitch. I very, very, very much appreciate that. Von Tux, thank you for the $5 dono. Let's keep going.
But the hardening of the opposition that we've seen on trans issues. We have been an exclusionary tent that is shedding imperfect allies, which is great. We're going to have a...
And oh yes, we've been seeing a real hardening of the of conservative values when it comes to trans people. Just the hardest the hardest hardening of values. They're just all over the DMs.
A really, really miserable, self-righteous, morally pure club in the gulag we've all been sent off to.
I think this goes to your point in a way. So after he made those comments, the Times reported that a local party official and an ally had compared him to a Nazi cooperator. There were protests outside his office.
Yeah.
We all know the most prominent political power is the Zoran Mami Dami power that is young cardamom.
Saki Tanuki, thank you for the 2 tier 1 subs. And yes, don't forget, folks, rank Zoran Mamdani 1. Do not rank Cuomo. But true. I love that, like, again, they aren't giving the context of like Chris Rufo, the Republican establishment picking trans issues as like the lightning rod for the current era. They completely just don't mention it and are instead talking about how like, oh yeah, people were really mad at Seth Moulton for, saying those mean words. But the issue is, right, Seth Moulton didn't just say mean words. He deliberately went out of his way to agree with one of the main conservative wedge issues. It is a wedge issue because it divides us. And if you stayed in solidarity with trans people, it wouldn't divide us.
I was always struck by which part of his comments got all that attention. It was a part I just read to you, but he'd also said this: having reasonable restrictions for safety and competitive fairness in sports seems like, well, it's very empirically a majority opinion. He's right on that. But should we take civil rights away from trans people so they can just get fired for being who they are? No. He was expressing opposition to what was about to be Donald Trump's agenda. And
yeah, and he expressed his opposition by agreeing with one of the main wedge issues on trans people. You're right. He was doing some tepid opposition to what Donald Trump's agenda while agreeing with the fundamental wedge issue of the administration when it comes to trans people. Like, I'm sorry, I don't trust someone who's willing to sell us out on that much. Like, you're giving up what? Like, if you're going to give up an inch there, they're going to take a mile.
And this space of his divergence from an issue that had already been lost, right? That was the polling was terrible on it. That was where people on the left focused.
From an issue that was already lost. The polling's terrible. Yeah, it's probably going to be terrible for a while, but we just need to defend it, and eventually the public will catch up with policy.
And his expression of support and allyship, as I saw it, barely ever got reported or commented on.
Mm-hmm.
It struck me as telling.
I think it absolutely is telling, and I think it's the best thing for trans people in this moment is for all of us to wake up to the fact that we have to grapple with the world as it is.
Why is she giving us homework when people like Seth make so little effort to educate themselves so we don't feel overwhelmed just trying to exist despite federal persecution?
Well, the issue is people like Seth Moulton doesn't like people like Seth Moulton aren't going to educate themselves. They need the education, but that relies on them being willing to learn. There needs to be a willingness to learn in order for education to happen. Thistles Fries, thank you for the $10 dono. But also, yeah, I'm sorry. She just told trans people that we need to live in the real world. We do. We do. Like, I'm sorry if you're upset with the fact that people have standards, we do live in the real world. Like, I would argue most trans people are some of the most economically precarious people on the planet. And I would argue that those in such economic precarity are the most connected to the real world, the world as it is. Because we know if we fuck up, if we wiggle on that tightrope a little bit, we're fucked.
That we have to grapple with where public opinion is right now. and that we need all of the allies that we can get. Because if you, again, Seth voted in against the bans. If we are going to defend some of the basic fundamental rights of trans people, we are going to need those individuals in our coalition. If you have to be
which individuals? Again, like the vagueness, the vague posting in this interview is off the charts.
Perfect on every trans rights issue for us to say you can be an ally and part of our coalition, then we're going to have a cap of about 30% on our coalition. If we are going to have 50% plus one, or frankly, more necessarily 60% or more in support of non-discrimination protections for trans people, in support of our ability to get the health care that we need, by definition, it will have to include a portion of the 70% who oppose trans people's participation in sports. And right now, the message from so many...
If you look back on the history of civil rights activism, you will know that she is just out of step with the history of activism, the history of political action on those issues, you know?
You're not welcome. And your support for 90% of these policies is irrelevant. The fact that you diverge on one thing makes you evil. And it also...
It's not the divergence on one thing. It is the fundamental idea behind the divergence. It is the root of the divergence, right? If the root of your divergence when it comes to like trans girls participating in high school sports is that they are men, that's a problem.
Trans people are usually pretty fine with trying.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't know a single trans person that's like, oh man, you know, my coworkers misgendered me the first time after I came out. I guess I have to cancel them. Like, that doesn't happen. That just doesn't happen. We understand our position in the world, and we extend grace to people who, in good faith, attempt to like integrate us into their lives. Full stop. Full stop. And the idea that trans people just aren't doing that, like, I'm sorry, that is the fantasy world.
Misunderstands the history of civil rights in this country. I mean, you can't compromise.
Oh God. Okay, you're going to talk about the history of civil rights?
On civil rights is a great tweet, but tell me, which Civil Rights Act delivered all progress and all civil rights for people of color in this country? The Civil Rights Act of 1957?
Jesus Christ. Oh my God. Well, you see, because they didn't achieve it in one bill, that means your arguments are all invalid. You know, let's just take a look. This is the rot at the heart of liberals. It really is, Exendu. It really, really is. Here we go. Let's just take a look at some of the historical polling on different civil rights issues of the day. 1961, Americans were asked whether tactics such as sit-ins and demonstrations by the civil rights movement had helped or hurt the chances of racial integration in the South. More than half, 57%, said such demonstrations and acts of civil disobedience had hurt chances of integration. I mean, that's 1961 though, right? Like surely that was the only time. Oh wait, 1963, a Gallup poll found that 78% of white people would leave their neighborhood if many black families moved in. When it comes to MLK's March on Washington, 60% had an unfavorable view of the march. In 1964, less than a year after Dr. King's march, Americans were even more convinced that mass demonstrations harmed the cause, with 74% saying they felt these actions were detrimental to achieving racial equality, and just 16% saying they were helping it. But we need to be just ahead of the public opinion, chat. Look, if only 16% of the population supports this, well, you know, we have to just be a little bit upfront about it. And so we have to say they're definitely not helping. The civil rights marches of Dr. King, they're definitely not helping. That's the position you would have to have if you had Sarah McBride's mentality in 1964. 1964, a majority of white New Yorkers questioned here in the last month in a survey by the New York Times said they believe the black civil rights movement had gone too far. While denying any deep-seated prejudice against black people, a large number of those in the 1960s, they talked very differently about black people. One-Eyed Heathen, thank you for the $5 super chat. While denying any deep-seated prejudice against Black people, a large number of those questioned used the same terms to express their feelings. They spoke of Black people receiving everything on a silver platter and of reverse discrimination against whites. More than 1/4 of those who were interviewed said they had become more opposed to Black people's aims during the last few months. This was in 1964. Chat. So just letting you know, holy shit, it sounds like today. It does indeed, because that was the beginning of the conservative backlash against the New Deal reforms. And the fact that she's resurrecting that for in 2025 for this, while attempting to make an appeal to history, is wild to me.
Civil Rights Act of 1960, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, or any of the civil rights acts that have been passed since the 1960s. That movement was disciplined, it was strategic, it picked its battles, it picked its fights, and it compromised to move the ball forward. And right now, that compromise would be deemed unprincipled, weak, and throwing everyone under the bus. And that is so counterproductive. It is so...
What is, I'm sorry, what is our version of the Civil Rights Act? What is the trans version of the Civil Rights Act right now? Because I'm pretty sure trans people would be pretty thrilled with codified rights in law, with more legislation keeping us alive and protected. So what's the version of the Trans Civil Rights Act? Because I can't think of one. And making this argument is really bizarre if there is none.
So harmful, and it completely betrays the lessons of every single social movement and civil rights movement in our country's history. And we have an example of a very successful social movement in recent history with marriage equality. Where would we have been in 2007 and 2008 if not only we had not tolerated the fact that Barack Obama was ostensibly not for marriage equality then, but if we had said...
Wait, but Barack Obama's position on gay marriage was irrelevant. The Supreme Court ruled on it.
To voters, if you're not even if you vote against the marriage ban, but aren't quite comfortable with marriage yet, that you're a bigot and you don't belong in our coalition. Where would that movement have been?
What are you talking about? But like it was ultimately irrelevant because the gay marriage was codified by the Supreme Court. So what if you had told voters this? Like, what? Okay, if you had told anything to voters, it wouldn't have mattered because it went through the courts. Oh, God. All right.
The most effective messengers were the people who had evolved themselves. We had grace personified in that movement, and it worked beyond even the advocates' wildest expectations.
What are you talking about? Like, I'm sorry, like, we had grace in that movement. Like, what are you talking about? There was no grace being extended to like people showing up with pails of rocks to stone us at our events. There's no grace to be had when you're dealing with bigots who want to deny you the right to get married. There's no grace there. What you do is you fight them and you beat them and you win. It is an existential struggle because it's not just that they're uncomfortable with you getting married if you're gay. They're uncomfortable with you going into bathrooms. They're uncomfortable with you, being around children. They're uncomfortable in a whole host of different ways. It's not just that they want to deny you the right to be married. They want to deny you the right to exist. Okay? That is the heart of the conservative take when it comes to LGBTQ people. And so I don't know here. I don't think that the LGBTQ movement regarding like gay marriage succeeded because a lot of grace was shown to bigots. What you do is you put out there enough education, enough people know that people they know and love are gay, and suddenly they shift their beliefs. And it's not because of some like come to Jesus moment they have with a random poster.
She's in most of the photos.
Oh, yeah. By grace, she's Sarah McBride is obviously referring to the hit queer television program Will and Grace. Saki Tanuki, thank you for the 2 tier 1 subs.
In terms of the speed of both legal progress and cultural
Stonewall, historically very graceful and palatable. Ignore all of the flaming bricks.
progress. Because we created incentives for people to grow, we created space for people to grow, and we allowed people into our tent, into that conversation who weren't already with us.
You mentioned the period in 2008 when Barack Obama was running for president. And at the very least, his
God, there's nothing Ezra Klein likes more than an opportunity to talk about Barack Obama.
public position, many of us suspected it was not his private position, but his public position, was that he opposed gay marriage. That was the mainstream position at that point in the Democratic Party. And there was a compromise position they all supported, which was civil unions. Is there an analogy to the civil unions debate or position for you now?
I think on the sports conversation, it's local control. It's allowing for individual athletic associations to make those individual determinations. And in some cases, they'll have policies that strike.
That's what they already do. They already do that. And they all already say, based on the science, that trans girls should be able to compete and against cis girls, and trans boys should be able to compete against cis boys. Like, that's already where the scientific consensus is. That's where all of these organizations and leagues have based their rules. And it's very, very frustrating that you don't take your cue on that.
Strike a right balance. In some cases, they'll have policies that are too restrictive. And I think that is the equivalent to the civil union's position in that debate.
Jesus
By allowing
Christ.
for Democratic voters, independent voters.
Why does Ezra not want to talk about Bill Clinton, who made his private position a very public position?
Look, okay, something dress. Sake Tanuki, thank you for the 2 tier 1 subs.
Even some elected officials to take that civil union's position, one that met voters where they were. It gave some of our politicians who needed it an off-ramp so that they didn't have to choose between being all on or all off. It allowed that conversation to continue and prevented more harm from being inflicted.
I want to pick up on the polling. So there's this YouGov polling from January that looked at all these different issues. And there are a lot of issues around trans rights that actually poll great.
Yes.
So protection from trans people against hate crimes, plus 36 net approval. Banning employers from firing trans people because of their identity, plus 33. Allowing transgender people to serve in the military, which Donald Trump is trying to rescind, plus 22. Requiring all new public buildings to include gender-neutral bathrooms. This surprised me, plus 7.
Yeah, because gender-neutral bathrooms are just better, guys. All bathrooms should be gender-neutral. Think of all of like the traffic it would free up. Think of like how much better the stall conditions would be. I don't know. It makes sense to me.
Then there's the other side. Everybody knows that the sports issue is tough in the polling, but banning people under 18 from attending drag shows, that's popular. Banning youth from accessing puberty blockers and hormones, that's very popular. Banning public schools from teaching lessons on transgender issues, that's popular. Requiring transgender...
Yeah, and this is why we shouldn't be taking our cues on what policy should be from the polling positions. Like, I'm sorry, the idea that we should ban teachers from talking about transgender people existing that's wild. That's insane. You cannot chase what is popular. You have to be the trendsetter. As I almost said, the trans setter.
Gender people to use bathrooms that match their biological sex, that is popular. When you look at these lists of issues, what do you see as dividing them? What cuts the issues that you could win on now from those that have heavy disapproval?
Well, I think that there's very clearly a distinction that the public makes between young people and adults. I think that there is a distinction that is made in many cases when it comes to what people feel like is government support of or funding of versus just allowing trans people to live their lives, allowing trans troops who are qualified to continue to serve, allowing trans people who are doing great jobs in their workplace to continue to work. It all goes back to this notion of get government out, let people live their lives, and let families and individuals make the best decisions for themselves. And I think that should be the through line of our perspective, a libertarian approach to allowing trans people to live fully and freely, that there are some complicated questions, but that those questions shouldn't be answered by politicians who are trying to exploit those issues for political gain.
Yeah, and again, this is where, again, it'd be really useful if you guys dove at all into the origins of why people are fear-mongering and using this for political ends, because frankly, Republicans correctly identified that Democrats wouldn't have the spine to actually defend trans people. And they were right. They were right, you know? It's the spinelessness is insane.
I was struck by your use of the word libertarian there.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I look at this polling, what I see is something quite similar, which is Americans, by and large, aren't cruel.
Mm-hmm.
And their view here is pretty live and let live.
Yes.
They have different views, which we can talk about in a minute on minors, where the question is the government coming in and bothering you being any trans person. They don't really want that. What they don't want to do is change their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Or think something is changing for them in their society.
What they don't want to do is change their lives or think that something is changing in their society. And it's like, well, that's kind of too bad. That's the nature of living in linear time.
Maybe those two things are not in all ways possible, certainly over the long term. But there are a lot of places where they are possible. It seems to me that in 2024 and over the last couple of years, what Republicans did very well, their approach to persuasion was to pick the right wedge issues.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think that the entire debate over trans policy in America was about NCAA swimmers. Like, this was the biggest problem facing trans people, the biggest problem in some ways facing the country, when it's a pretty edge case issue. And questions like non-discrimination and access to healthcare are much more widespread.
Yeah, I'm just kind of throwing this out there that maybe acknowledging that it's a wedge case issue, you should stand in solidarity with the people that it's trying to wedge you again. Instead, the cowardly thing to do is to break towards the conservative end of the argument. That's the cowardly thing to do. That's the entire purpose of a wedge issue.
What they did was they used their wedge issue, and they're now attacking those majority positions, right? Trump is attacking discrimination, right? He wants people discriminated against. He doesn't want trans people to be able to put the identity they hold and present as on their passports. It's not a huge winning issue for him. And so there's this question of picking the right wedge issues.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a wedge issue for you that you wish Democrats would pick?
Well, I think that we do much better when we keep the main thing the main thing. Defending Medicaid in this moment is the main thing.
For everybody.
For everyone. And look, I think abortion to some degree had been a wedge issue that was to the Democrats.
I love that, like, she's just like, yeah, the wedge issue that we should go with is Medicaid. That's not a wedge issue. Like, that's not actually a wedge issue. That's the main issue. A wedge issue is a smaller niche issue that you can use to fracture the Republican Party. That's not going to be Medicaid. If that was the wedge issue, it already would have triggered a huge conversation in the Republican Party.
Advantage, not to the Republicans' advantage. But I think we have to reorient the public's perception of what our priorities are as a party. And I think when we lean into the culture wars and lean into culture war.
Yeah, she said it was the main issue for Lauren, but she was asked to name a wedge issue, and she picked the main issue, which is not. Anyway, you understand.
Or wedge issues, even if they benefit us, they reinforce a perception that the Democratic Party is unconcerned with the economic needs of the American people. When you ask a voter, what are the top 5 priorities of the Democratic Party? What are the top 5 priorities of the Republican Party? And what are the top 5 priorities for them as a voter? 3 out of the 5 issues that are the top issue for that voter appear in what their perception of the top 5 issues for the Republican Party. Only 1 of their top 5 priorities appear in their perception of what are the top 5 priorities for the Democrats. That's healthcare, and it was 5th out of 5. The top 2 were abortion and LGBTQ issues. And I don't care what your position is on those 2 issues, you are not going to win an election if voters think that those 2 issues are your top issues rather than their ability to get a good wage and good benefits, get a house, live the American dream. And I think we have to, in this moment, reinforce what is our actual priority as a party, which is making sure that everyone can pursue the American dream, which has become increasingly unaffordable and inaccessible, that everyone should be able to get the healthcare they need, be able to buy a home.
Is Sarah McBride distantly related to Benedict Arnold?
Montax, I have no idea, but Like, she's not wrong insofar as in order to win in politics, you need to be able to assure your base that you are going to help them materially, that it's with your leadership, you are going to allow them to be able to better their lives. Like, people need to be able to believe in that, but simultaneously, you also need to advocate for the rights of people in your district, the rights of people who live and are represented by you. You need to be someone who's able to communicate that you are both there to materially improve your voters' lives as well as fight for their rights. That's your job, Sarah.
Send their child to childcare without breaking the bank if they can even get a spot. That needs to be our focus. And I think when we have this sort of purity politics approach, LGBTQ issues or abortion, what we communicate, even if we're not talking about those issues, is we communicate those are threshold issues, and therefore the voter reads that as those are priority issues. And the only way to convince the voter that those are not our priority issues, that that's not what we're spending our capital and time on, but rather giving them healthcare and housing, is to make it abundantly clear to people that our
abundantly clear? No. I kid. But also, what would be really, really nice in this conversation would be an acknowledgement that there is a multi-million, at bare minimum, possibly billion-dollar propaganda apparatus inundating Republicans with anti-trans messaging all the time. You've got like your feelers out, your support for like YouTubers like Tim Pool and Charlie Kirk. You've got like the fear and hate mongering of like the Southern Baptist churches and the evangelical, Christian nationalist movement. You've got like an incredible array of propagandistic tools at the disposal of the Republican Party. And I just think that is way more significant than like people being mean on Twitter. You're not going to be able to. I'm sorry. I'm just too upset to be able to articulate this properly.
And can include diversity of thought on those issues.
Like the reason Republicans think that Democrats stand for like, I don't know, the Green New Deal and trans rights first and foremost, it's because they're lied to on a daily basis. They live in a fundamentally different reality. A reality shaped by untold amounts of money and conservative values.
Something that I notice in the broad coalition of groups and people and funders who identify as or support Democrats is that they all want the issue they care most about to be the issue that gets talked about the most.
Yeah.
People who fund anything from climate to trans rights.
Yeah, people tend to want to talk and push the thing they like, yeah.
To all kinds of the hotter issues in American life. You could actually imagine a strategy where those groups and that money went to making every election about Medicaid.
Can you, though? Why would they do that? Why? Like, again, this entire podcast is imagine if neoliberalism was correct, though. Wouldn't that be neat? Like, that's not going to happen, Ezra.
Democrats. We put the fun in fundraising.
Jesus. They do, don't they? Sake Tanuki, thank you for the 2 tier 1 subs. Appreciate the support.
Because Medicaid is just a killer issue for Democrats. And then the people who get elected are better on those other issues too. But it doesn't. That money, those groups that are organizing, what they often want Democrats to do is publicly take unpopular positions on their issues. I think all the time about the ACLU questionnaire.
Yeah, they want that to push their special interests. Yes, because there is an underlying dynamic here of corporate power, of capitalistic power, Ezra, the one that you steadfastly attempt to ignore 24/7.
That asked candidates, and in this case Kamala Harris, whether she would support the government paying for gender reassignment surgery for illegal immigrants in prison.
Oh my God. Why are we bringing up this thing from like 6 years ago? We're talking about how she answered a survey question 6 years ago?
Even if your whole position in life is your point is to make that possible, the last thing you would want is for anybody to claim it out in public, right? You'd want...
Why? Unless you are incredibly weak on the issue, and she was, the very easy, very strong position is just emphatically, yes, I believe everyone in this country deserves health care. Yes, I think that if a prisoner gets sick, we should, as the state, have a duty to treat them.
Does Ezra think that every right-wing position is popular? Virtually every conservative supports assault rifles and 6-week abortion bans.
Yeah, that again, excellent point, Paladin. Thank you for the $5 dono, because conservative positions aren't popular, guys. It's not a popular idea for Republicans to cut Medicaid and Medicare in order to give the biggest tax, the biggest tax cut in human history to the richest people to ever exist in our country. That's not popular, but they're doing it anyway. And you have to ask why. It's because they want it, because their big time donors want it, because that's how power works. And so what's interesting...
Racist, sexist, Republican, these words are virtually interchangeable.
Indeed. Thank you, DB Wolf. Ezra Klein is an infuriating son of a bitch.
Nobody would ever think about that question ever at all. And it's something I've heard Democrats talking about more after the election, just rethinking on some level this question of, is the point of all this organizing to get politicians to commit to the most maximalist version of your issue set? Or is the
maximalist leftist
point of this organizing to somehow figure out how to win Senate seats in Missouri and Kansas? So you have very, very, very moderate Democrats who nevertheless make Chuck Schumer the Senate majority leader rather than John Thune.
Right. I think that there is an incentive from money and from social media, and those also...
I fucking love that the analysis here is, oh yeah, it's money, but also social media. Like, no! Touch grass! Politicians in Congress, touch more grass! Like, it's the money, stupid! People being mean on social media shouldn't be influencing your policy!
The difference is that the GOP media works to unify the base and bring people in line, and DNC media works to divide the base.
I mean, you're not wrong, but like, damn. Hearing the argument that you should care more about the opinion of shitposter 420 Blaze It 6969XXX than, like, I don't know, $1 million donated to your campaign. Which do you care more about? Because so far, shitposter 420 Blaze It seems like they got the upper hand in this power dynamic. You listen to these guys.
So go hand in hand sometimes with grassroots donations that incentivize the groups to want to show their influence and their effect by having politicians fight the fights that they want them to fight.
I'll be right back. Gonna go slam my head against a brick wall. Much more productive. Yeah. Also, in case that gets clipped out of context, I wasn't saying these guys in a transphobic way. I was saying it in a generalizing way. Don't you dare clip it out of context.
In ways that feel viscerally comforting to their own community that they're representing. And I get that. I understand that. One, we have to be better as elected officials in saying no, in saying public...
Shitposter 420 Blaze It 69XXX is based though, Jack. I've been known to enjoy a poster too.
Public opinion is everything. If you want us...
Public opinion is not everything. Points at civil rights polling. In the midst, 1965, in the midst of the Cold War, a plurality of Americans believed that civil rights organizations had been infiltrated by communists, with almost a fifth of the country unsure as to whether or not they had been compromised. That's... In other words here, guys... Around 70% of the country was either convinced that civil rights organizations were being run by filthy communists, or they were on the fence about it. But yeah, sure, public opinion is everything.
To change, you need to help foster the change in public opinion before you're asking these elected officials to betray the fact that they are, at the end of the day, representatives that have to represent.
You have to make it popular before they're willing to have a spine and be brave about it. Shit, man. This is why modern Democrats are weak as hell. This is why modern Dems are weak, okay? They're not willing to actually fight for an issue, you know? I just... As we all know, interracial marriage was extremely popular when it got legalized. I literally talked about that earlier. I literally brought it up. I showed the graph and everything. But yeah, again, using Sarah McBride's logic, interracial marriage shouldn't have been legalized until the year like 2000. Insane.
In some form or fashion, the views of the people that they represent. Like at some point, you will represent the people's positions or they will find someone else who will. And so it is just an unsustainable dynamic for the groups to continue to ask elected officials to take these maximalist positions, to ignore where their voters are. They have to do the hard work of persuasion. And there's always going to be a tension between the groups and elected officials. Everyone has to do their own job, but there has to be some degree of understanding.
How do you hold that tension? I always think this is such an interesting question for politicians to work with, because there is the internal and the external push to authenticity.
Yeah.
We don't want these poll-tested politicians. And it's also your job to represent.
Yes.
On issues personal to you, on issues not as personal to you.
You have to represent, but you also have to be yourself. It's not that deep, man.
But have you ever thought that maybe giving up and surrender is somehow a winning position? It's not called weakness, it's called being a political loser.
You know, I hadn't considered that the winning position would be the fetal one.
Neolibs are a cult who worships power, whose gospel is a series of line graphs, and whose sacrament USXA ritual sacrifice of their principles.
I mean, you're not wrong. I have a lot of contempt for neoliberalism. It is the deregulation that led to the current crisis with Donald Trump. Just full stop. It is the full embrace of the deregulatory project, and it only lends power to private corporations until suddenly they've amassed so much that they have billionaires richer than most nations on earth, and they are personally running the country. And so I just, the attempt to resurrect the neoliberal project, just as we're about to try and try and take power and unfuck the country away from fascism, it's especially galling.
How do you think about balancing they elected you versus you are their servant?
Yeah. Look, all of these decisions inevitably require a balancing of my own views, my own principles, and the views of the people that I represent. But I think one thing you always have to do is you have to go, okay, here's an issue that I feel very strongly about. I vote against this. What are the second, third, and fourth order consequences of voting against or voting in favor? You might abstractly agree with something as an ideal, but if you were to pursue that or implement that policy, it would have, in the medium to long term, a regressive effect because there's a backlash to pushing too hard or taking too maximalist of a position by the mainstream in our politics. One of the problems we've had is that we have said, not only you have to vote the way we want you to vote, but then you have to speak the way we want you to speak. And I always have said,
what do you mean by that? Do you mean like voters don't like it when their politicians are like transphobic? Like, what do you mean? The vague posting is off the charts.
Even when I was an advocate, if we can get the policy vote that we want and the compromise we are accepting is essentially a rhetorical compromise, that is a pretty darn good deal.
I agree. Give me an example where that happened and it was torpedoed by people policing language. What is the example that you're putting forward here? What is the, like, okay, when has the conservative movement ever come to us and said, okay, all right, here's what we got, okay? You give up the neo-pronouns. Okay, you give up the neo-pronouns, they're making us uncomfortable.
Fucking pronouns!
And then, in exchange, we allow you to have civil rights. We're all good. Where has that happened? She's talking, okay, but you can say like she's talking about birthing person, and I can understand that take on it. But the issue I have here is that there's never been like conservatives coming out and saying, okay, if you just stop saying birthing person, we'll stop talking about trans healthcare. Like that deal has never been on the table.
And again, I think we have to be willing to have these conversations out in the open. We have to recognize that there's
as somebody who constantly has conversations on the internet, like what conversations aren't happening? I was being facetious. I wasn't.
Complexity, there's nuance, and that means not just in the policy space, but in the political space. And that's authentic. To say these are some really difficult conversations, and sometimes I'm going to get it right and sometimes I'm going to get it wrong. And sometimes I'm voting exclusively with what I think is the right.
As somebody who talks a lot online, if somebody came into a conversation with me and said, hey, like I'm trying my best to get all this stuff right, but maybe I might not say the right thing all the time. I'm willing to have conversations with those people. Some of those people are in my own family. These conversations are had all the time. So I'm not sure what conversation she's thinking just doesn't happen.
Thing to do, even if my voters disagree, but also sometimes I'm going to have to take a balanced view of this. And that's democracy.
I want to pick up on speech. It's true on trans and gender issues. It's also true on a bunch of other issues in the past couple of years. That a huge number of the fights that ended up defining the issue were not about legislation, they were about speech. I've always myself sort of thought this reflects social media. But I mean, the number of people who've talked to me about the term birthing persons.
Nathan Drake in YouTube chat, you fucking called it. You magnificent son of a bitch. You called it. You did it. You win the prize. Jesus.
Which I think virtually nobody has used. Or Latinx was a big one like this. There is in general this extreme weighting of can you push changes of speech onto the people who agree with you and possibly onto society.
What are you talking about of pushing the speech? Speech changes all the time. Out of necessity, out of, a sense of spontaneity and fun, but also out of necessity. And the reason language changed around trans people, like take birthing person, for example, the reason that was introduced was to specifically materially help trans people who were dying, who were suffering because the implicit assumption had been, well, only women can get pregnant and give birth. And if you have trans men coming and they're being overlooked when it comes to pregnancy, that's a huge problem because it means people die, right? Like, so that's a necessity. That's language changing out of necessity. And I don't know, we live in a world of Skibbity Riz, Ohio, and like, seems like if you can accept Skibbity Riz, Ohio, you can accept birthing person.
As a whole. And that the strategy worked backwards from the speech outcome, not the legislative outcome.
Jack, never say that again. Look, I know I just said like 3 Gen Alpha slurs. So you guys are going to have to live with it.
How do you think about that weighting of speech versus votes?
I think, look, there is no question in my mind that the vote is much more important than the rhetoric that they use. We have sort of discoursed our way into like, if you talk about this issue in a way that's suboptimal from my perspective, you're actually laying the foundation for oppression and persecution. And I just...
Yes, I'm sorry, again, if you're lacking the additional aspect of this that has been absent for this entire conversation so far, that there is a multi-million/billion-dollar propaganda campaign being run 24/7 against trans people that has lasted for the last decade. If you don't see the problem with adopting the rhetoric of that propaganda campaign, I don't understand how you're able to even begin to comprehend politics.
Just think like, maybe academically that's true, but welcome to the real world.
You're not doing this in a vacuum. Exactly.
Like, we are prioritizing the wrong thing. It's an element of sort of virtue signaling. Like I'm showing that I am the most radical, I'm the most progressive on this issue because I'm going to take this person who does everything right substantively and crucify this person for not being perfect in language. It's a way of demonstrating that you're in the in-group, that you understand the language, that you understand the mores and the values of that group, and it's a way of building capital and credibility with that in-group. I think that's what it is. And I just think it's like, it's inherently exclusionary. And I think that that's part of the thing that's wrong with our politics right now, which is that
again, you know, you've heard me make this argument before on stream, okay?
Jack, language is eternal and unchanging. Did you forget the Bible verse where Jesus said, "This is my body, paying the phantom tax for you, fam"?
I did forget that. I did forget that. Thank you for reminding me. Thank you for the $5 dono as well, Paladin. And I just want to throw out there, guys, I don't know if you guys remember, but I've talked about this a lot in the past, where I think one of the things we need to go back to teaching in school is rhetoric. Rhetoric is one of the things we need to bring back in school. It used to be that people would learn rhetoric in the classroom, and rhetoric is the art of persuasion. It is the idea that you should learn in school systematized ways of thinking about, you know, positions and being able to argue for or against those positions. It is a way of organizing critical thought, and I think it's very, very useful. And I think that an entire generation, you know, multiple generations growing up not learning how to rhetorically advance ideas is a really big problem. I think we're running into a lot of that right now as a society. And I think if you can't understand how rhetoric, i.e. the art of persuasion, is not important, if you are using the same tactics of persuasion and the same ideas as a Republican, you are advancing the same ideas. You are aligning yourself with the Republican Party in a way that is actively opposing trans rights. I am a bit frustrated because I feel like I've been saying the same thing over and over and over again throughout this entire conversation. But I hope that maybe me breaking it down in possibly the most bare bones way I can, I hope that helps.
all of our politics feels so exclusionary. The coalition that wins.
Oh, God. For those of you saying, I see you in Twitch chat saying, I make bad jokes about it, but critical thinking is really being lost. Total tangent. And we're going to talk more about this in a future segment, but just some fascinating stuff here from a study that was released on June 10th of this year in Artificial, where was this published? Cornell University. Your brain on ChatGPT, accumulation of cognitive debt when using an AI assistant for essay writing task. This study explores the neural and behavioral consequences of LLM-assisted essay writing. Participants were divided into 3 groups: LLM, search engine, and brain only, no tools. Each completed 3 sessions under the same condition. In the 4th, LLM users were reassigned to brain only group, LLM to brain, and brain only users were reassigned to LLM condition, brain to LLM. A total of 54 participants took part in sessions 1 through 3, with 18 completing session 4. We used electroencephalography to assess cognitive load during essay writing and analyzed essays using NLP, as well as scoring essays with help from the human teachers and an AI judge. Across groups, NERs, N-gram patterns, and topic ontology showed within-group homogeneity. EEG revealed significant differences in brain connectivity. Brain-only participants exhibited the strongest, most distributed networks. Search engine users showed moderate engagement, and LLM users displayed the weakest connectivity. Cognitive activity scaled down in relation to external tool use. In session 4, LLM to brain participants showed reduced alpha and beta connectivity, indicating underengagement. Brain to LLM users exhibited higher memory recall and activation of occipitoparietal and prefrontal areas, similar to search engine users. Self-reported ownership of essays was the lowest in the LLM group and the highest in the brain-only group. LLM users struggled to accurately quote their own work. While LLMs offered immediate convenience, our findings highlight potential cognitive costs. Over 4 months, LLM users consistently underperformed at neural, linguistic, and behavioral levels. These results raise concerns about the long-term educational implications of LLM reliance and underscore the need for deeper inquiry into AI's role in learning. In other words, folks, using ChatGPT and other AI large language model tools makes you dumber. It literally activates less of your brain. It literally like dumbs you down. It is, a problem for how you think. When we're talking about the problem of critical thinking being on the decline, that's what
reduced
it's a very
alpha
real
and beta
risk.
brain usage is what makes you a sigma cuck.
Paladin, thank you for the $6.90 dono. I appreciate it. Yeah, alpha and beta brain usage makes you a sigma cuck, indeed. Oh, God. Also, apparently, again, total aside, apparently XAI is costing Elon Musk $1 billion every month to run. And they had there's nothing that is possibly making it profitable at this particular point in time. Like, it's $1 billion a month up in smoke from that particular endeavor. Insane, unsustainable.
Riverboat deck is going to town. All the viewers gather round. Twitch and YouTube and swishy streams. All that content is bursting the scenes. Politics, gaming, and plenty more. Your sense of fashion you'll adore. So grab your stuff and hop aboard. We're going straight to Jack's Discord. Riverboat Jack. Riverboat.